When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds don't travel to a nation, they travel to a symbol, to the pyramids that pierce the sky like stone needles, to the colossal statues that watch us with eyes of eternity, to the temples whose columns seem to support the weight of the cosmos itself. It is an image of absolute power, of a civilization that, it seemed, had found the formula to defy time. But what few imagine is that this giant, which reigned supreme for more than 3,000 years, did not succumb to a single fatal blow. Its fall was not the roar of an empire collapsing, but the silence of a heart that slowly stops beating. It was an agony that stretched for centuries, marked by internal fissures that opened like cracks in the divine throne, until the entire edifice collapsed upon itself. To understand how the empire of the pharaohs came to an end, we first need to understand what sustained it. Egypt was not just a nation, it was a worldview. The pharaoh was not simply a king, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the sacred link between the world of the gods and the world of men. The entire social, economic, and religious order revolved around this figure. The Nile, the source of all life, was considered a gift from the gods, and its annual flood, which fertilized the land and guaranteed the harvest, was seen as a direct blessing from the pharaoh. Any threat to this order, any questioning of this divine structure, was seen as an attack against the cosmos itself. However, the seeds of destruction were already planted in the heart of the system that made Egypt so powerful. During the New Kingdom, the golden age of the warrior pharaohs, the accumulated wealth was immense. Temples, especially that of Amun in Thebes, became centers of economic and political power that rivaled the crown itself. The high priests controlled vast tracts of land, herds, mines, and armies of workers. While the pharaohs celebrated their military victories and erected monuments that defied the heavens, a parallel theocracy grew silently, accumulating power and influence that, sooner or later, would clash with royal authority. The seed of discord had been planted, and all that was needed was a catalyst for the division to become irreversible. The New Kingdom represented the peak of Egyptian military expansion and cultural splendor. Pharaohs like Thutmose III led campaigns that extended Egypt's borders from Nubia in the south to the banks of the Euphrates River in the north. The tribute flowing into Thebes was immense: gold, ivory, ebony, incense, cattle, and slaves. The city of Thebes, with its monumental temples at Karnak and Luxor, became the spiritual and political center of the known world. It was a time when the pharaoh's power seemed absolute and the kingdom's stability unquestionable. However, beneath this glittering surface, a fundamental tension was beginning to manifest itself. The temples of Amun-Ra had become economic corporations, as powerful as the state. They possessed not only land, but also ports, naval fleets, and private armies. The high priest of Amun, often a member of the royal family or noble lineages, amassed wealth that rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. This concentration of power created a dangerous imbalance, where the divine authority of the pharaoh began to be overshadowed by the material influence of the clergy. It was in this context of growing antagonism that Amenhotep IV emerged, a pharaoh who would go down in history as Akhenaten, the heretic. His ascension to the throne was met with great expectation, but no one could have predicted the religious revolution he would unleash. Akhenaten, possibly influenced by a mystical vision or a calculated political move, decided to break with the traditional cult of Amun. He proclaimed that the only true god was Aten, the solar disk, a deity that had existed in Egyptian theology for centuries, but had never occupied a central position. In the 5th year of his reign, he changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning he who is useful to Aten, closed the temples of Amun, confiscated their properties, and ordered the god's name to be erased from all monuments. It was a declaration of war against the established power. The new capital, Akhenaten, was built on a desert plain in central Egypt. It was a planned city dedicated exclusively to the worship of Aten, where Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and their daughters lived in a kind of divine seclusion. The Amarna reliefs show an affectionate royal family bathed in the light of the solar disk, which extends its rays in the form of hands toward the royal couple. But this idyllic image hid a worrying reality. While Akhenaten dedicated himself to his new theology, the affairs of the empire were neglected. The Amarna Diplomatic Archive, a collection of hundreds of clay tablets written in Akkadian, reveals the chaos that reigned on Egypt's borders during the reign of Akhenaten. Princes of city-states in Syria and Canaan, vassals of the pharaoh, desperately pleaded for military aid against attacks from nomadic tribes such as the Apiru and against the ambitions of the kingdom of Mitanni. Akhenaten's response, when it came, was vague and ineffective. The letters, often broken and poorly preserved, show local rulers abandoned to their own fate, questioning the loyalty of their neighbors and begging for troops that never arrived. The Egyptian colossus was beginning to show its first cracks. With the death of Akhenaten, his religious revolution died quickly. His young successor, Tutankhaten, under the influence of the priests of Amun, restored the traditional cult and changed his name to Tutankhamun in honor of the restored god. The capital was moved back to Thebes, and Akhenaten was abandoned to the desert. The tombs of Akhenaten and his successors were desecrated, and his name was erased from the royal lists. But the damage was done. The inviolability of the pharaoh, his unquestionable religious authority, had been irrevocably challenged. From that moment on, the divine aura that protected the throne was tarnished, and the path to the fragmentation of royal power was open. After the brief interlude of Tutankhamun and the consolidation of power by generals like Horemheb, the 19th dynasty would bring back the military glory of Egypt. Under the command of Seti I, and especially his son Ramses II, the country experienced a new period of splendor. Ramses II, known as the Great, ruled for an impressive 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. His reign was marked by unprecedented constructive activity and masterful political propaganda. He was the architect of his own legend. The Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire around 1274 BC, became the ultimate symbol of his reign. Although history tells us that the battle was, at best, a tactical draw, Ramses managed to transform it into a glorious victory in the reliefs that adorn the temples of Abu Simbel, Luxor, and Karnak. The walls of these sanctuaries tell the story of a solitary pharaoh who, abandoned by his soldiers, faced the enemy army alone, defeated only by the divine intervention of Amun. The propaganda, of course, worked. Ramses became the quintessential pharaoh, the model of a powerful warrior ruler. Ramses' art was grandiose and megalomaniacal. He erected more statues and monuments than any other pharaoh. He had his name carved into temples built by his predecessors, appropriating their works and almost erasing their identities. He built a new capital in the Delta, Pi-Ramses, and signed the first known peace treaty in history with the Hittites, guaranteeing stability and trade in the Near East. Apparently, Egypt had never been so prosperous, so stable, and so powerful. However, appearances are deceiving. The prolonged reign of Ramses II, although celebrated, drained the state treasury. Natural resources were exhausted to feed his constructive appetite. The administrative system, overburdened and inefficient, began to show signs of collapse. Taxes, which should have sustained the state, were increasingly diverted to the temples and into the pockets of corrupt officials. Furthermore, Ramses II left behind an immense progeny with over 100 children, which generated dynastic disputes and competing factions within the royal family itself. Succession, which should have been a natural and orderly act, became a source of instability. Power, which emanated from the throne, was now disputed in its own chambers. When Ramses II finally died, already in his 90s, he left behind a tired and impoverished Egypt. His successors, all named Ramses, were far less imposing figures. They carried the weight of an unmatched legacy and the debts of an empire that had lived beyond its means. The military machine, which had once conquered nations, was worn out and underfunded, and the once secure borders had become vulnerable to attacks from nomadic tribes and migratory pressures from other regions. Egypt had reached the end of an era, and what would follow would not be its restoration, but its slow and painful decline. The collapse of Egyptian power in the 12th century BC was accelerated by a historical phenomenon of catastrophic proportions, the invasion of the so-called Sea Peoples. This expression, coined by modern historians, refers to a confederation of ethnic groups that between 1200 and 900 BC migrated from the Western Mediterranean eastward, destroying everything in their path. The exact causes of this exodus are the subject of academic debate, but hypotheses include prolonged droughts, agricultural crises, earthquakes, or the demographic pressure of expanding populations. What matters for the history of Egypt was the devastating effect of their arrival. These invaders, identified by names such as Peleset, Teker, Shekelesh, and Denyen, among others, were fearsome warriors who moved both by land and by sea. They did not come only to plunder, they came to settle. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival, was completely annihilated by these migratory waves. City-states in Syria and Canaan, such as Ugarit and Alalakh, were razed and never rebuilt. The collapse of international trade, which linked Egypt to these regions, had cascading effects on its economy. The world that Egypt knew was going up in flames. Ramses III, pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, faced the invading waves with determination. His reliefs at Medinet Habu in Thebes are vivid documents of this struggle. They show epic naval battles, with Egyptian ships maneuvering between enemy vessels, while archers, positioned on the prows, fired volleys of arrows at the invaders. Ramses III's victory over the Sea Peoples is considered one of Egypt's greatest military achievements, which ensured its survival while other civilizations disappeared. But this victory came at a terrible price. The war effort depleted the state coffers and decimated the ranks of the army. To replenish his troops, Ramses III made a decision that, while pragmatic in the short term, proved disastrous in the long run. He integrated prisoners of war into his army. Libyans, Nubians, and even members of the Sea Peoples who had surrendered were recruited as mercenaries. They received land, titles, and power. Within a few decades, the ethnic composition of the Egyptian army had drastically changed. The soldiers defending Egypt were no longer Egyptians by birth, but foreigners whose loyalty was, at best, negotiable. The sword that protected the pharaoh was now in the hands of men who did not share his faith. The political crisis culminated in a shocking episode known as the Harem conspiracy. In the 29th year of his reign, Ramses III was the victim of a plot hatched by one of his secondary wives, Queen Tia, who wished to place her son, Pentaweret, on the throne. The judicial papyri that recorded the trial of the conspirators reveal a plot involving high officials, heads of guards, administrators, and even magicians, who supposedly created wax figurines with magical properties to weaken the pharaoh. The coup failed, and the conspirators were executed or forced to commit suicide, but Ramses III died soon afterward, possibly as a result of deep wounds to his throat, as suggested by modern examinations of his mummy. A pharaoh, a living god, had been murdered by his own family. The image of inviolability that protected the throne was irrevocably broken. From that moment on, succession to the throne would be disputed not by divine criteria, but by the sword. And that sword was increasingly in the hands of foreigners. With central power weakened, administrative chaos and corruption spread like a plague throughout Egypt. The officials charged with protecting the state's treasures, including the royal tombs, became its greatest predators. In the Valley of the Kings, the necropolis where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried, what should have been a place of eternal reverence became a field of systematic plunder. Greed corroded the last bastion of eternity. The tombs of the pharaohs were built to withstand time, designed with secret passages, traps, and inscribed curses to deter invaders. But against human greed, the obsession with eternity, these defenses were useless. The judicial papyri from the late 20th dynasty document the brutal trials of captured tomb robbers. In one of the interrogations, one of the looters confessed, "We opened the sarcophagi. We found the noble mummies of the kings. We found gold in abundance. We took everything we found and set fire to the rest." What lies behind these words is a horror that transcends simple violence. The mummies of the pharaohs were not just embalmed bodies, they were vehicles for eternal life. The gold amulets, the jewels, the scepters, and the canopic jars were not mere adornments. They were magical objects, charged with divine power, essential for the resurrection of the king in the afterlife. Looting a tomb was not just a crime, it was an attack on the cosmos, an attempt to prevent the living God from achieving immortality. It was stealing from the gods their own creation. The loyal priests, horrified by the desecration of the tombs, took desperate measures. They gathered the mummies of many of the pharaohs they managed to save and hid them in two secret hiding places. One of them was located in Deir el-Bahari, near the temple of Queen Hatshepsut. The other was in the tomb of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. There, in absolute silence, the mummies of some of Egypt's greatest rulers, Thutmose III, Ramses II, Seti I, remained hidden for almost 3,000 years until they were rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. This act of preservation was, at the same time, the most eloquent testimony to the collapse of Egypt's sacred order. If the dwelling place of the gods on earth could be violated, if the protective rituals no longer had any effect, what remained of the belief that held the world together? The foundation of the Egyptian soul had crumbled.